Today we're going to be installing coilovers into my 2007 Subaru Legacy GT. This is a wagon, so it might be a little bit different for sedans, but for the most part it should be pretty similar. So let's get started. I'm going to be starting on the rears. We're up on 2 jack stands, one on either side now. Take off the rear wheels. On either side, so you're going to see, it's kind of tough to tell right now, but this is a 19mm nut. This is 19mm bolt. This is for a lower strut mount. Just take some penetrating fluid and just spray those down while we take off the other wheel, just so we don't really strip anything. It comes off a little bit better. Take a 19mm socket with a breaker bar or an impact gun, whichever your choice. And we're going to take off the nut on the lower strut mount. Remove the lower strut mount bolt. So easiest kind of way to do this, I find, is that since this bolt is quite long and the threaded part where the nut is, that's towards the outside of the vehicle, isn't that long to actually kind of hammer it out. So what I did is I stuck an impact on the bolt side, which is on the inside of the car, and kind of just worked it out until it was free. And just a heads up for this one, I have a jack here. Support the suspension assembly. This is under tension, the entire strut assembly. So if you don't have anything, it could suddenly pop out or anything like that. And also, I find it makes it a little bit easier when you kind of jack it up. That way you don't have the downward pressure of the spring and the strut pressing down on this bolt. So once you have that out, basically do the same thing on the other side, and then we'll move to the inside of the car to get the top mount bolts out. We're in the inside of the car now. This is the back area of the wagon. So usually you have your floor panels and everything here. I'll kind of just do a quick mock-up. I took this out just so it's a little bit easier. So basically you have your center portion here. It's held on by these 2 black clips at the end. So all you have to do is kind of lift it up, tilt it, and then pull out. These side panels, they're held in with these little tabs, so all you have to do is kind of grab firm pressure. They actually even have little cutouts here for your hands to go into. You pop, same thing on the other side, pop both of those out, and then for this back portion there's a pop clip here, and I couldn't see it when I was pulling it out, but actually if you look, there's the 2 white tabs towards the front of the car. Those are actually pop tabs as well too. Where those pop tabs have gone, I am not too sure. Hopefully I'll find them later. But as you can see here, we have our strut mounts. They're not super easy to see, but they're there. These nuts at the top for the strut mounts are 14mm. So what I'm just gonna do is take a wrench. This is a ratcheting one, which will make things a little bit easier. Pop those 2 out. You might want to support something underneath the strut so it doesn't just fall straight down, and then it should be free. So just a tip with these nuts on the tops for the rear strut mounts, what you can do, you don't have to take this panel off. You can kind of push it in and out. When I pull it out, you can't see it, but it gives you enough clearance to kind of either slide. I don't think really a socket and a ratchet would be the best idea. If you have one of these ratcheting wrenches, these are probably your best bet because these aren't on super tight. So yeah, if you just kind of move these back and forth, it'll give you enough clearance to grab those. So once we have those out, we can go out back again outside and slide the strut out. Now with both rears out, this is our driver's side, it's our passenger side. Not that it really matters. They're old and crusty. We're gonna go inside, because we all know everyone keeps car parts in their room, and grab our new coilovers there. Now you can admire your old crusty rear suspension versus these aren't new. These are new to me, but these are KW V2 coilovers. Previous owner thankfully already left the top mounts on them, so these are ready to install. I'm just going to adjust these heights. So KW, if you look at their instructions, they have min and maximum threads. So their minimum is 10mm for the rear, in terms of how many threads you should, like the distance of threads you should have left. So we'll just adjust that. Now to throw in your new rear coilovers. If you're working by yourself, I would do it this way. If you have a friend, obviously they can kind of support the strut up while you're doing the nuts on the inside. But if you're working by yourself, basically place the strut top hat into the designated bolt holes into the rear of the chassis, so you can have access to the studs to put the nuts on, and just use a jack to just prop it up in place. I don't know why, but the driver's side to do these top hat nuts are actually, it's a lot more accessible compared to a passenger. But when you're doing these up, you don't have to do them super tight right now. We're going to be actually tightening these down finally when the car's on the ground, so the full weight of the car is actually sitting on it, so all the threads that you could possibly thread onto are exposed. So once you just have these on just to hold the strut up, we'll just go back outside and put in the bottom bolt. So before we put on the bottom bolt back on, it's never a bad idea to use some anti-seize. So I'm just going to coat the bolt before I throw it into on the car, and that way when we have to take it off in the future, it'll be nice and easy. Kind of same deal. We're going to use a jack to prop it up. You want it to use the jack to lift it up to kind of line it up with the factory lower strut mount location. This is because your coilover is most likely going to be shorter than your OEM strut. If you're doing it with an OEM strut, just a replacement, then it should line up okay. But regardless, it's a good idea to have a jack underneath, compress it up, and just to kind of get it aligned. Basically, when you have your coilovers set to the height that you want them, so for these ones, the KW V2s, KW specifies a minimum thread remaining of 10 millimeters to 40 millimeters is kind of the ideal range that they suggest. So what I did was I kind of went in between. I went 20 millimeters on both sides, and I'll kind of lower the car, let it settle a little bit and see how it is, and kind of adjust it from there. So sometimes you could go all the way low and adjust it up. I find like a medium is probably the safest way to go. So once we do that, now what we can do is just throw our wheels back on, and then put the car back down on the ground, and then we'll move on to the front. As you can see, the car is back down on the ground. So like I said, I have these adjusted with 20 millimeters of adjustment travel left. So theoretically we could go 10 centimeters lower, and as you can see, we're pretty much top of the tire is just flush with the edge of the fender. So what I think I'm going to do is actually go ahead, do the fronts, but I'm going to further adjust these to the max load, just why not? So since that's done, we can move on to the front. So front should be relatively straightforward. It's just like a normal McPherson strut style. So we'll just jack this side up and then get to it. Now that we have the rear of the car back down onto the ground, and with the full weight of the car on the struts themselves, we can go ahead and go inside and tighten down these strut mount bolts. So these ones, you don't have to reef them on super tight, honestly. I always kind of tighten them to what I think should be best, because you're gonna have a hard time getting a torque wrench in there with the trim in. So I would just tighten them up as much as you can without going too overboard, and then go for a drive, see if you have any rear clunking. If you do, they're probably not tight enough, but honestly you should be able to go after you tighten these down. The biggest issue that a lot of people has is they'll tighten these up while the car's still in the air, thinking they're tight, and when they drop the car back down, it'll expose a few threads, and they'll drive and they'll hear clunking. So to avoid that, do this while the car's on the ground. Now with the front of the car jacked up and our front wheel off, we can get to basically all that we need to remove the front strut. So at the bottom, you can see here we got two 19 millimeter nuts and bolts. The top one is your camber adjustment, so if you want, you can mark that up. To be honest, I'm trying to get as much negative camber in the front to gain as much clearance. And then the only other thing was ABS or speed sensor bracket. From what I remember, I think that's a 14 or 12 millimeter, probably a 12 looking at it. And then other than that, we basically move up to the top, and then for our top hat, we have our 3 nuts here. These are, I believe, 12 millimeters as well. So basically, with those out, we can drop the front strut out. The old strut free. The other thing I forgot to mention is that there's this brake line here. So the brake line, this wheel sensor, and also the top strut mount bolts are all 12 millimeters. Can't really talk right now. So those just come off, and then all you have to do is kind of drop down the strut. Then it's basically the reverse for the install of the new coilover. So we'll throw that in right now. So now with our new coilover in and our ride height preset and everything buttoned up on the bottom, you just want to make sure that you properly torque these bolts down. I believe the torque spec is like 75 or 80 foot-pounds for the actual strut bolts. And similar to the rear, sorry, it's really hard to see, I put the light on the other side, but your top hat bolts, same, well, your nuts, same thing. You want to just snug them up and then wait to actually finally tighten them down when the car's on the ground, so the full weight's on it. So with that, we'll just move on to the other side. And last corner, here we go. Alright, so if you've ever lowered your car or put bigger wheels and tires on it, you know that sometimes you're going to run into fender issues where your tire or your wheel is going to hit the edge of your fender. So there's a few ways to go about this, but the most common way to gain more clearance is to roll your fenders, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you how to do today. So there's a few different ways to roll your fenders, but the most commonly, and I want to say the most accepted practice, is to use a fender roller. So here I have my Eastwood fender roller. I've owned this for a few years now. Honestly, you can either have a shop roll your fenders for you or an independent person do it yourself, but it's really not that hard. And you can actually find, if you don't own a fender roller yourself and you don't want to invest in one, there's a few people, usually locally, that are always renting them out. I will sometimes rent mine out too. You can find them anywhere between $15 to even upwards of $40 a day, which I think is ridiculous. But 15, 20 bucks, you should be able to get that. And then the other thing you'll need is a heat gun. So what the heat gun's gonna do is, we'll just walk over to the fender here. So I'm gonna be rolling this rear fender for demonstration purposes. You wanna use the heat gun to heat the paint on the edge of this lip and also on the outside as well too. That way, you're basically warming up the paint and you're gonna allow it to stretch a bit more. Sometimes if you do this on a really cold surface, your paint will actually crack, and that's no fun because then you could have rust forming and stuff like that. So ideally you wanna roll your fenders on a warmer day, and actually if you can, have the car outside so that the sun is almost baking the panel. But in this case, we're inside of a garage because I was just doing my coilover install. So you just have to use a heat gun just to bring this up to temperature, and that's pretty much it. So other than that, you just need your hardware to take off your wheels. So in this case, for me, it's a 19 millimeter. So 19 millimeter and either a tire iron or a breaker bar or whatever you want to use to take off your wheel. And then we'll move on to actually mounting the fender roller. Okay, so to mount your fender roller, it's pretty easy. There's slots for the lug studs to go through. If you have a European car where they use lug bolts, then obviously you just want to line up the holes and then throw them in. And you'll actually get these spacers. So these fender rollers usually come with 5 because they're meant to be used on a 5 or a 4 bolt pattern vehicle. So what these spacers do, a lot of people don't actually know this, but you want to take these and slide it over the lug stud so that when you're, and make sure that there's like a conical part and a flat surface part. So put the conical part towards the outside of the vehicle. That way when you're threading your lug nuts in, it doesn't actually damage the fender roller itself. I mean, the fender roller's made out of pretty solid steel, so I don't really see why it would be damaging it, and you don't have to actually reef these on. You just want it tight enough so that the fender roller isn't moving, but that's what you want to do. So usually what I do is I'll have one of these spacers and a lug nut just on either side. So once you have these tightened down, just snugged up, just so that the fender roller doesn't move, then you can move on to actually rolling your fenders. Okay, so before we actually begin rolling our fenders, you want to make sure that your inner lip is relatively clean. If you have like sand and dirt and stuff, it'll actually embed and you could potentially, again, scratch off paint, Or even worse, if you're doing a really aggressive roll where it's flat and you have sand embedded on the inside, it can actually make little dimples or like kind of pokes in the metal itself. So you don't want that either. So make sure that like you kind of quickly clean this down and make sure you have a clean working surface. Now to the actual fender roller itself, so it has this pivot head here, which you loosen on this side, and it allows you a pretty good range of motion. So what you want to do to roll your fenders initially is to start off, you know, relatively so our fender lip right now is straight horizontal. So you want to position your fender roller just slightly past that so it's not too aggressive. Then you just use this crank here and you apply firm pressure after you've heated this surface up and make a couple passes. You keep on rolling until it stops feeling like there's a lot of resistance, and then we can back the fender roller off with this lever and then reheat our paint and then readjust our head. So as you're going, so if you start like this, we can go like this on a second pass, like that, and you just want to keep on gradually going more basically vertical to get that aggressive roll that you need. Or if you just need a mild roll, then you could just stop pretty much at that point. So what we want to do next is heat up our paint. So when we're heating up our paint, basically what I like to do is I'll make a pass along the outside and then I'll make a pass along the inside. And we want to keep on doing this back and forth. Another kind of what I do is after I do a few passes, I'll run my hand, for demonstration purposes, like just like so, run my hand alongside of it, basically towards the back end of it. So if this heat gun is rolling that way, then we want to have our hand just behind it. If you start feeling like it's getting too hot where you can like, it's like you put your hand down, it's like, oh my God, that's too hot. That's probably a good place to stop. Honestly, like if you hold your hand there for 2 seconds and then it's too hot, that's probably the ideal temperature, but it's a little bit tough to say because each person's different on how their heat threshold is. So kind of just go, as long as your paint's not cold and it's warmed up, you should be okay. And as long as you're not being super aggressive with the fender roller and you take your time, you shouldn't have any paint issues. But in case you do, I always like to have a backup as like either rust-proof paint or bed liner or even like the paint pens, just to cover up any peeled paint chips that you might have. So we'll get on to actually rolling the fenders now. And boom, just like that, as you can see. So the fender lip used to basically be as flat as this trim portion, but now it's been folded in. So I say that's a job well done. So yeah, like I said, you want to do kind of slow, gradual passes. I did about 6 different passes, and sometimes you might need a little bit encouragement just to get it to get flattened a bit more. So what I like to do is make sure the paint's really warm and then just use a rubber mallet to kind of almost flatten it out. But other than that, rolling your fenders is pretty simple. So in this case, I do have a little bit of rust here, so I didn't really worry about the paint in this area. I'm gonna go grind that down, do some refinishing body work there. But yeah, if, like I said, if you have any little chips or anything like that, just touch it up with some paint or some bed liner, kind of whatever you want to use to protect it from the elements so it doesn't rust out. So hopefully that helps. Just a quick, simple, easy way to roll your fenders. There's other ways that are seen as not as proper, like using a pole or a baseball bat. I don't really recommend those because you can't really get the consistency. And I know a lot of people, they pull their fenders with a fender roller, but I don't recommend that either, because when you pull it with a fender roller, your edge of your lip on your fender actually curls out, and I think that, personally, I don't really like that look. So I prefer the phone book method, which is where, so if we go to the front of the car here, it's where you stick a phone book, you jack your car up, stick a phone book in between the space between your fender and your tire, and you want to put either like blocks of wood or something underneath that one wheel, just so it'll be compressed fully when you drop the jack, and that'll gradually pull your fender out. Again, use heat so you're not preventing to like cause any paint damage, but also with pulling your fenders, you want to be careful, because if you pull them too much, you could potentially buckle your fender or anything weird like that. So that's the method that I like to use for pulling fenders. literally the same process. All you need is a heat gun and a phone book and a jack. So hopefully this helps. I know it's pretty much a mandatory thing to do when you're lowering your car with some aggressive wheels and tires, but it's not super hard, so give it a shot and you'd be surprised at how easy it is.